Hello, I'm George Brown. I want to welcome you to the second in my series of the Armchair Traveler. If you were with us last week, I gave you two assignments. The first was to find a good chair for your armchair travel, because you'll remember that's the first requirement, is to find a comfortable place where you can do your exploring. And that's the second requirement for armchair travel, to do some exploring. That's what we'll be doing today as we begin a series of armchair travel experiences. Today we're going to be looking at Marco Polo. Well, why did I choose Marco Polo? Well, Marco Polo is someone that we know a little bit about, but I said, if you're like me, you don't know too much about him. So I decided that would be a good topic for us today. Also, I stumbled recently on a book. It's a book by John Mann called Marco Polo, The Journey That Changed the World. I like this book for armchair traveling for two reasons. One, it seems to be very historically accurate. A lot of research went into it, so it gives really good information about the life and times of Marco Polo, both what he tells about in his books on his travels, but also about the historic documentation to determine what is real and what isn't real in his writings. But secondly, and for our purposes, just as important, I think, the author doesn't just tell about Marco Polo, he actually retraces the steps of Marco Polo's journey through the Silk Road some 750 years ago. So it's a very good history, but also travelogue about Marco Polo. So I think it's a great book to use along with some internet work that I did. It gives us a basis for an armchair travel experience. So let's begin with what we know about Marco Polo. If you're like me, you know a little bit, but not too much. We know that he was from Venice in Italy. He lived in the 13th century. He traveled across what was known as the Silk Road to China. He stayed there for a number of years, and after he returned, he wrote up his travels in a book called The Travels of Marco Polo. And we have reason to believe that his works had some impact on Europe in his day and on future explorations to Asia. So that's about all we know. Oh, there's one other thing. We learned later in life that what we may have learned in school was not accurate. Marco Polo did not, I repeat, did not bring pasta from China to Italy. So we've been able to debunk that part of what we may have learned earlier. So we know just a little bit about him. And today I hope we can spend a few minutes exploring a little more deeply to find out more about Marco Polo and why he is of such interest over the years. If we want to learn about Marco Polo, we really need to start with a journey that his father and uncle took years before he did. So if we go back to the year 1253, two Italian jewel merchants, Polo brothers, set out on what turned out to be a very long business trip. As they left, one of their wives was pregnant with a boy that would become Marco Polo. The two brothers went first to Constantinople, and they stayed there 6 years. Not an ordinary business trip. This one would last 16 years. They began in Constantinople, which was closely linked economically with Venice in the day, and really was a hub for doing trade with goods that would have come from further east. They were there. From there, they went up to the Black Sea, to the Crimea. They were there for 3 years, and then went farther east to Bukhara and what is today Uzbekistan. They were there for a couple of years and were planning to return home, but something changed their plans and really changed history in that regard. They ran into an envoy, we may refer to him as a traveling ambassador, from Mongolia, or actually from China, from the headquarters of the Mongolian Empire. He was a representative of the Emperor Kublai Khan. And as he was returning to China, he met the Polo brothers and he invited them to travel with him back to China. And as adventurous tradesmen, this was an offer they couldn't resist. So we have the two Polo brothers continuing their journey, ending up in the court of Kublai Khan. And apparently he took favor with them, took him into the court, They continued to be successful in their trading business. And when it came time that they wanted to return home, he placed two conditions on granting them permission to leave to return home. The first, he wanted them to return. They were eager to return, so that was not a difficult request. He also asked them to bring back 100 Catholic priests and holy oil from Jerusalem. Now, this would seem to be a very curious request for a leader from China in those days. But apparently there was some feuding going on in his court between the Taoist priests and the Buddhist priests. And apparently he thought maybe to have some Christian priests there to put in the mix might create some balance. So they returned with the promise that they would try to come back bringing the priest. So they returned home to Venice 16 years after their original departure. When they got home, they found that Niccolo's wife had died, leaving a son who now was a teenager, 15, 16 years old, young Marco. They stayed in Venice for 2 years and then began their trip back to China and decided to take the teenager with them. So Marco Polo, at age 17, 18, 19, somewhere in there, late teens, begins the first of his long journey, his lifetime experience, heading east to China. So let's take a look at the route they would have taken. It's the old Silk Road. Let's take a look at what that was all about. So we have the ancient Silk Road that was ancient by the time of Marco Polo. Journeys between China and Europe go back to the Roman Empire days, as you'll see on the screen here. It shows here as a road going through Central Asia. Really, it was a series of roads and passageways linking Europe with China. So it was an ancient concept of going overland through Central Asia from Europe to China. Now, the Silk Road region today, to provide it some contemporary context, really goes through a series of nations that were part of the former Soviet Union. You'll see on the left there the Caucasus states of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then on the east of the Caspian Sea, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. So these are the stands. This is the very desolate area of Central Asia that are independent nations today, were part of the Soviet Empire after being taken over in the 19th century by the Russian Empire, today independent. But in the days of Marco Polo, were the principalities that you pass through if you're traveling on the Silk Road from Europe to China. Now, the Silk Road today is still a very desolate part of the world. The writer of the book that I told you about, John Mann, took that trip. Here's a photo from his trip. It's part of the road linking China and Pakistan. Doesn't look all that foreboding here until you learn that this road is about 15,000 feet above sea level. Very desolate part of the world to travel through in Marco Polo's day, and it remains so today. Now let's look at Marco Polo's route that he took with his uncle and his father. You'll see up in the left-hand corner of the map, Venice. They traveled first to Jerusalem because remember, they were to bring priests and holy oil back from Europe. Well, they didn't have much luck with getting the priests, but they did get some holy oil. They continued on through Armenia, then down to the Persian Gulf, where they expected to take a ship. They hoped to find a ship that would take them to China because that route was well known. They were not successful on that. So then they went overland, over through Central Asia. It was a trip that would take them 4 years. It's a long trip in any circumstance, but apparently young Marco got sick and delayed them almost a year in Central Asia. And we have in the book that of Marco Polo's journeys, the tedious and difficult travel going through this area. And that's replicated in John Mann's book as he travels the Silk Road route taken by Marco Polo. Now they were traveling through the Mongolian Empire, seen here with a picture of Kublai Khan, their sponsor when they got to China. The Mongol Empire developed by his grandfather Genghis Khan as the Mongolians came out of Mongolia, headed east and west and south to build this tremendous empire. It's said that it may have included as much as 20 or 25% of the world's population at the time. Well, how did they succeed in building such an empire? Well, like any successful empire of that day, probably of our day as well, it takes military might and superiority. And in those days, that was achieved through horsemanship. The horses were able to travel up to 100 miles a day, something that was unheard of. So you have this mighty, and they were excellent archers. And so you have this mighty force coming out of the north, successfully conquering all the way to Europe and down through China. It also takes organization and logistics to establish and maintain an empire. And the Mongolians were able to do that under Genghis Khan and his successors. One of the things that was fascinating to me about the Mongolian Empire was to learn that they had something that was very similar to the American Pony Express of the 19th century. They established these way stations all over the empire with horses in reserve. And the rider with the message or the mail would go from one stop to another, change horses, and keep going. So it's a very efficient way of traveling across the vast empire. Now, when they got to China, when they got to Kublai Khan, they were well received by him. In the first instance, he was disappointed that they didn't have the 100 priests with him. But he was pleased to have the holy oil. And apparently, he was very pleased to be introduced to young Marco. Now, here we have to have a caveat. What we know about all these encounters and the tales told by Marco Polo are a bit self-serving. And so it's not surprising that he would paint a picture of his relationship with Kublai Khan in a very positive way. But given the fact that historically we've been able to confirm that he made all these travels throughout China and throughout the Mongolian Empire, it really serves to vindicate the fact that there was a strong relationship that developed between the young Marco Polo and his sponsor here, the Emperor Kublai Khan. And so he was received into the court and he learned the language, he learned the culture there. He stayed 20 years and during that time became somewhat of an emissary, apparently, going throughout the empire, traveling to the great cities of China, but also perhaps as far as Java in today's Indonesia, to India as well. He tells about Japan. He didn't go to Japan, but in his books, he writes very glowingly about Japan, this island nation to the east of China with the streets paved in gold. We'll come back to that later. He didn't get to Japan, but got to many of the other places. Now, for us reading about Marco Polo today, I suspect that for many of us, if you're like me, you've traveled to China. Many Americans have traveled to China, spent time going there. And so we know something firsthand about China today, but also the antiquities of China. And so while that's interesting, we have firsthand knowledge of that. For me, the travels to and from across Central Asia may be of more interest. But for the people of Marco Polo's day, what he brought back in terms of information and stories of China really is what set Marco Polo apart. So he came back with these magical tales of China, describing an area that people knew about, but knew very little about. They knew China was there. They knew some of the goods that came from China, but they didn't know much about China itself. So Marco Polo in his writings then tells all these tales. A lot of them were tales. They were very exaggerated, but still gave a picture, painted a picture of Chinese society and China itself that heretofore had not been known by the Europeans at all. and he gives great detail. He went to various places. He talks a lot about Xanadu, which is, if you've been to China, I'm guessing you haven't been to Xanadu. It's just now being excavated. It's not too far from Beijing. It's to the north, right up on the edge of the Great Mongolia Plain. But this was a site where Kublai Khan would have his summer palace. So Marco Polo spent a good deal of time here. And what fascinated Marco Polo about this was that it was a combination of Chinese culture and Mongolian. So the Mongolian people were nomadic people, and some of the great structures that Marco Polo describes in his books from Xanadu are portable temples and portable palaces that could be taken down in the winter. So the emperor would come here for 4 or 5 months in the summer and then go to his permanent capital, which he made in Beijing. Now, he was the first one to make Beijing the capital of China, and had great buildings and palaces created that, again, are not there. Some of them are being excavated as well. It's thought that his original palace probably is in the area of where today's Forbidden City is. But there's one structure that Marco Polo talks about that does still exist. And it came to be called over the years, I'm not sure when or exactly why, but came to be called the Marco Polo Bridge. It's a main bridge leading south from Beijing. And so it would have been crossed by all as they went into China from the heartland of China from Beijing. It has some historic interest. If you're a World War II buff or historian, you may remember something called the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Well, it turns out this is where that took place. In 1937, as the Japanese were advancing against China, a military incident took place here that was used by the Japanese as a pretext for expanding their military operations. And the bridge still exists, still known as Marco Polo Bridge. Marco Polo in his writings tells a lot about the Chinese society and its infrastructure. He was taken with this, amazed at some of the accomplishments of the Chinese. One that he talks about is paper money, which had been invented in China long before it was used in Europe. But one of the infrastructure items that attracted his attention was a Grand Canal. Again, if you've been in China, you may have seen it pictured here on the right. The Grand Canal was an amazing engineering feat. It had been well established before Marco Polo's day, but was being completed. The northern part, up all the way to Beijing, was being completed in the Marco Polo era. So here you have a canal for transit, for shipping, for people, going from Hangzhou, the old capital, all the way up to Beijing, 1,100 miles. And in addition to linking these two great cities and all the towns and villages in between, it also linked the two great rivers of China, the Yellow River in the north, the Yangtze River in the south. And we learn about, and the Europeans learned about this maybe for the first time from Marco Polo. He visited many cities in China. One that he was taking with was Hangzhou. Again, if you've been to China, you've probably been to Hangzhou, a city not too far from Shanghai. Unlike Shanghai, which is a very modern city, Hangzhou is an old city and is a great place to visit because you have a lot of the old temples and buildings that go back to the earlier days in China. Again, Marco Polo writes very lavish descriptions of Hangzhou. He talks also, as I mentioned, about traveling to other parts of the Mongolian Empire. We don't know exactly where all he went, but he may well have been to India, Vietnam, Indonesia. There came a time, though, after 20 years, that the Polo brothers and Marco decided it was time to return to Venice. Several reasons, perhaps, for that. They may have, after all those years, wanted to return home, although when they got home, it turns out that their Italian had gotten a bit rusty. They also recognized that the hold that Kublai Khan had on his empire was beginning to slip. There had been two failed invasions of Japan that were very costly in men and materials and resources. and also a failed invasion of Vietnam. So his grip on the empire, Kublai Khan's grip on the empire, was beginning to decline. He was getting older as well. And they realized that their connection in China was totally dependent on his being in power. So they wanted to go back to Venice. They got permission to do so only if they agreed to escort a princess, a Chinese or Mongolian princess, to Persia, where she was intended to marry one of the Mongolian leaders there. So they agreed to do that, bade goodbye to the Mongolian emperor, headed south, this time by water. They went on the Grand Canal down to Hangzhou, then down to the port, and then by ship over through Indonesia, over around India, the west coast of India, to the Persian Gulf, and then up to Persia, only to find that the Mongolian leader that she was to marry had previously died. So they had to stay there a little longer, finding a suitable substitute husband for this Chinese princess, and then on back to Venice. When they got back to Venice, they weren't welcomed with open arms at first because their relatives thought they were long dead. They had trouble convincing them that they were, in fact, the Polo brothers and the Polo son. And the story goes, probably apocryphal, that they were wearing rags so that they wouldn't be robbed. They opened up their rags, the jewels fell out, and then they were welcomed with open arms by the relatives. Marco Polo was in his mid-40s, had another 25-year life as an Italian merchant. He married, had children, and so it's the end of his story could have ended there. That it may not have been ever written up, and if it hadn't been written, then we wouldn't have known about it, and Marco Polo simply would have been a figure in history that was obscured because of lack of documentation. But something happened a few years after he returned to Venice. There was a bit of a war between Venice and its counterpart on the western coast of Italy, Genoa. Marco Polo was on a ship, a Venetian ship, military ship of some kind, and he was captured by the Genoese and put in a prison. Probably it was a home prison kind of thing, a house arrest. He was there for about a year before they finally ended up with some kind of prisoner exchange, and he returned home. But what he found was that his cellmate, fellow prisoner, was a writer, an Italian writer, Rustichello da Pisa, who was a writer, they say, of romantic fiction. Now, I don't know what kind of romantic fiction was being written in the 13th century, but this gentleman was such a writer. And he was there with Marco Polo, and Marco Polo started telling him the stories of 20 years in China. And this writer starts writing it down. Marco Polo got his family to send his notes from Venice over to Genoa. And so over the course of the year then, this Rustichello becomes a ghostwriter for Marco Polo's adventures. So the tales of Marco Polo that then came down through history are a result of his transcribing the results of Marco Polo's dictation of what happened. So we have here Marco Polo embellishing in a self-serving way his account of his years in China, and this writer also probably embellishing it to make it a better story as well. But it's because of that that we have these tales that were written. They became popular in Marco Polo's day, even before the printing press. And 100 years later, after it goes into actually printing of books, it becomes a bestseller. And so Marco Polo becomes somewhat of a traveling hero at that time. He tells about China. People know it's an exaggeration, but still it gives the story of China. And in this regard, I think even with all of the exaggeration, Marco Polo comes across as a man who really was interested in the culture. He was immersed in that culture. He spoke the language. He wasn't there as a conqueror. He wasn't there as a missionary. He was there as a trader, but became immersed in the culture itself. And so what comes across in his books then is the stories really of a cultural traveler. And so in that sense, his books become not just a history of what he did, but also almost a cultural anthropologist. And so he is seen maybe as one of the first travelogues that was written up. And today, as a matter of fact, if you go to the internet, and if you're interested in your armchair experience of going to some of these lists that they have on the internet of armchair travel book lists, you're likely to find the travels of Marco Polo listed there. Now, I have to confess, I haven't read the actual travels. You know, I've read this book here. Maybe someday I'll read the actual travels, although I really prefer this, where you have the history plus the contemporary story of the Silk Road. So that really is the story of Marco Polo, but it's always interesting to ask the question, well, what happened next? What was the impact? So one question is, well, what happened to the Silk Road after the days of Marco Polo? Well, they continued to be used, but in 1453, the Turks, the emerging Ottoman Empire, takes over Constantinople. It becomes Istanbul. And so the land route over the Silk Road from Europe to China becomes cut off. And even going by ship through the Persian Gulf, that becomes difficult as well. So the Europeans became interested in another route to China. The Portuguese looked at the route going around Africa. They knew that if they could get around Africa, they'd be in the Indian Ocean, to go from there around India to China. So they kept probing Africa to find how they could get around Africa. And finally, in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz, sailing for the Portuguese, rounded the southern tip of Africa, and they knew that they would be able to reach China that way. But there was a competing country, Spain, and there was a competing sailor by the name of Christopher Columbus. And he convinced the Spanish crown that, well, we can do it more direct. Why don't we just go across the ocean that we know is the Atlantic Ocean, and we can get first to Japan, because we learned from Marco Polo that there are riches in Japan, and from there on to China. So he got the sponsorship of the Spanish crown, sailed, as you know, 1492, and he was right. But the one thing he missed, two things he missed, was the continents of North and South America and the huge Pacific Ocean. Christopher Columbus, to his dying day, was disappointed that Cuba didn't turn out, in fact, to be Japan. But that's a whole different story of Christopher Columbus. But it is interesting that his motivation, even his greedy motivation, may have been triggered in part by Marco Polo and the writings about China then. But in the centuries following that, the sea routes dominated. You have in the 19th century the creation of the Suez Canal and the control really of the British Empire through Egypt and India all the way over to China. And so the sea routes dominated the commerce really, rather than the Silk Road. It's interesting today, though, that there is a resurgence of interest in the Silk Road commercially. You may have heard of something that's called the Belt and Road Initiative by China. So this was announced by the Chinese leadership just a few years ago, that they were going to spend hundreds of billions, maybe $1 trillion, in developing ports and transportation systems linking China and Asia with Europe. So you see here, in a way, the remarkable, reminiscent of the Polo voyages. You see there the land routes that are being proposed that go through Central Asia, and then the sea routes as well. Remember, the Polos went the land route when they went from west to east, and when they went from east to west, it was by sea. So what the Chinese are doing is developing relationships, signing agreements with all of the countries where you see these ports, from Asia, India, Africa, all the way to Europe. And then in the middle, you'll see what's called the overland route. And that's a combination of improved roads and highways, but also railroads. So the idea for China is that they can expand their relationship commercial and political relationships with Europe and all of Eurasia, India, Africa, by investing heavily in this, in what at one time was the Silk Road. We don't know how far this will go, but it is important today. And I think historically it's interesting to see that here we've gone back to perhaps expanding the land route, the old Silk Road, that was how Marco Polo and his relatives got to China in the first place. It's interesting to me, having spent a little time now on Marco Polo, that the first agreement, really the only agreement so far on the Belt and Road Initiative by the Chinese is with Italy. You see here the picture of the Italian and Chinese leaders shaking hands as they signed an agreement on this just very recently. See a shot here of a contemporary picture of contemporary Venice. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to Venice, and you'll remember that the airport is named after Marco Polo. I have here the logo for the Venice airport. It's not a little of irony here, I think, that the Chinese, as they are expanding their connection with Europe over the old Silk Road, turns to Venice, where they're going to develop port expansion in Venice. I can imagine that somewhere Marco Polo is looking down and smiling as he realized that more than 700 years later, the connection between China and his city of Venice is being expanded, this time with the initiative coming from the east, moving to the west. The other way the Silk Road continues to be of interest is through adventure travel. This may be on some of your bucket list, to go to Central Asia, where, because it's been so isolated, you can still encounter the antiquities, the old cities of Samarkand, Tashkent, some of these other historic cities, and see antiquities that may not be that different than they were in Marco Polo's time. Here's an example of a tour: 8 countries, 29 days, $6,500. Apparently you go on a camel for part of it. I hope not more than an hour or two. I've not been on a camel, but I understand the travel is not that comfortable. So if you're an adventure traveler, it may be that you still have the Silk Road, or maybe you've been to some of the places of the Silk Road. I don't know if I'll make it back to the Silk Road or not, but by looking into the life and times of Marco Polo and approaching it from the vantage point of a armchair traveler, I think it's fun and interesting to both see what he did, how that had an impact on Europe, and also to look at that area today and to see what's happening. Now, next week, we'll be doing another armchair travel experience, this time closer to home. We'll be looking at another journey, that of Lewis Clark and Sacagawea, the Indian guide that made it possible. I'm calling it the Great American River Trip, because in the early 19th century, the rivers were the highways. So we'll be looking at what they did, what they accomplished, but also I think that whereas it may be, the Silk Road may be out of reach for us for a while, I'm hoping that sooner rather than later, we'll be able to do some trips in the United States, and there's some great opportunities for retracing some or all of the route followed by Lewis and Clark. So until then, I hope you stay safe and keep your travel dreams alive. Thank you.